First of all, welcome.
Yes, welcome. My name is Mircea. I've been working with OpenEdge for the last 10 years.
And my name is Ovidiu. I'm a front-end architect, and I'm working primarily with Angular and all front-end technologies.
Something noted, this is the first time actually being here at Progress Next, and it's actually also the first time doing a session, so be gentle with us. We will talk about who's mark information, this is us, and what are the challenges that we've had. We have like an old application, and of course, when doing modernization projects, there's always tons of things that you can talk about, but we don't have time. So we just picked 3 topics that we will talk about. It's the API layer, which is a hot topic always. It's reporting, because there are actually little sessions this year talking about reporting, and there's also security and authentication, which again is a really, really, really hot topic today. Jump into it. Mark information, basically it's a best-of-breed workforce management solution founded actually in '81, which is the same time as Progress OpenEdge. Sorry, just Progress. And it's headquartered in Denmark. It has been focusing primarily on the Nordic European area. And well, what I find it actually interesting is that it serves more than 300,000 daily users and has more than 400 customers. And well, it's a ginormous application, really, really important, and it basically covers everything that has to do with time. Time registration, everybody knows time is money, and it has time and attendance, scheduling, absenteeism, planning, task management, and all that gets complemented with a little bit of business intelligence. So, like I said, we have a more than 25 years old application. And one of the key portion of that application, it's a web application, which was started actually more than 15 years ago, based on web forms, ASP.NET, and it's connecting directly to the database using ProxyGen. TCP, not really secured. It brings a lot of value to existing customers, but like all legacy application, it doesn't exactly look modern, and it's not exactly fast. That's a secret. But that was a challenge we had 3 years ago. And at that point, well, we had to choose between actually trying to continue to develop that one into new frameworks, or actually jump and do everything from scratch using a new set of tools, which is what we did. Out with the old, in with the new. Basically, the new architecture that we have in place has nothing to do, well, almost nothing to do with ASP.NET and Microsoft technologies, but instead it's based on Angular and material design. It's always, performance is always in mind whenever trying to add features to this one, and like all modern applications, it's actually based on REST services. And we've been quite busy in the last 3 years. We've built more than 80 reusable APIs, and what's nice about it is that actually we got to use some of the really, really old legacy code. Some of them were written in '95, something like that, and could expose them as REST services. Also super important is that this is REST services, so it means to be reusable. That's why actually today it's a multi-client application, so same services used by web, mobile, and terminals. That is also being complemented by technically our agile development process, because we went from a waterfall development process to agile, and that actually helped us a bit with time to market.
So, after a lot of brainstorming and with great help from our management, we came up with this architecture, which not only services our existing customers through the ProMark server business logic layer and the ABL database, but also has the REST APIs on top of it, so we can support our new and exciting clients, like our new Android terminals, our mobile application, our new and improved web portal, and also integrations to third parties like Salesforce and a lot of other people that want to integrate with us. One other thing to note is that the REST API layer has to be fast and deployable to the cloud. So in that sense, no matter if you're a ProMobile user or a Portal user, you have to have multi-tenancy in mind. So what we did is actually embed the tenant, make the tenant embeddable in the URL. And we are on a journey of achieving our cloud goals. However, since most of our implementations are on-premise, we are a bit struggling with that. But the architecture permits it, and that's the most important thing. So in order to implement the architecture, we had to devise a new pipeline of how do we bring these things to market. And like Mircea said, we went with the cutting-edge technologies on the front end, like Angular, TypeScript, and Kendo UI, and leveraging Progress OpenEdge on the back end. Also, we've been using Roundtable for a lot of time, but now with the new front-end clients and the REST APIs, we decided to go with Bitbucket as well. And that provides a lot of flexibility, and we will see why later on. Also, in terms of Agile and continuous integration, we have implemented Jira, Jenkins, SonarQube for code quality, and also for testing, we have a lot of unit tests, integration tests. And in terms of our cloud journey, we will probably very soon have containers, Kubernetes, Docker, be able to deploy on platforms like Rancher and Azure and any other cloud provider that our clients might want.
So let's talk about REST API layer. It's, well, technically it's not the newest technology, and everybody's been using, well, there's a lot of modern applications out there using REST interfaces, but this is REST with OpenEdge. I'm not going to go into too many details because there are a lot of very good sessions out there talking about REST interfaces, but this is more like an overview. Assuming you have at least version OpenEdge, well, 11.6, because this is based on the new application server, there's primarily two kinds of services that you can use. The first one is the REST adapter, and this one is a bit older, and it's actually not based entirely on OpenEdge, but instead it's based on Java. And it's using the HTTP client from Java to do all kind of stuff. But what's nice about it is that actually you can hook it up directly into any kind of procedure or procedure. You don't need to have a specific interface to do that. The downside with that is that, like I said over there, it's actually some PAAR files actually that holds all the exposing and artifacts of that configuration, and we will see forward that it's not exactly straightforward. On the other hand, there's the web handler, which is kind of new, and it's based on ABL. It's a bit harder to work with, but it does offer a lot of flexibility. So this is the REST adapter. I hope my dark interface is not exactly confusing. What's nice about that is that you can super easy expose any kind of procedure that you have. It might be a procedure, it might be a class, it doesn't matter. It might be an internal procedure of another procedure. Again, it doesn't matter because you're just browsing for a procedure and doing drag and drop in order to map anything from a web request into your internal procedure and back against the web response. Super nice about it is that it has something called services, and that's just a way to group URIs into one, let's say, package. The nice thing about that is that the service name actually gets exported into the URI. So imagine having a resource called employees, so it's /employees, but under one specific scenario, you want actually to behave it differently. So you might have the same resource /employees, but defined under a different service. So you can have like test /employees or my main app /employees. It's meant to do two different things, and that's actually super good. Also, since this was designed actually initially to super easy expose your data sets or pro data system table, it doesn't matter. The content type, it's hard-coded to application/JSON. This is actually super important because if you intend to use this kind of web services for doing something differently, like just sending text or pictures, images, this will not work. It's hard-coded. There are ways to do it, but its workarounds, it's not exactly the best idea. There's also some negative sides about it. If you do this kind of mapping over and over again, let's imagine you have one procedure and you actually want to enhance that API with some new verbs, some new capabilities you want to map again. Or if you have changed your input parameters because you have your internal procedure, you're changing your input parameters, it might be a data set that has changed. You always need to remap. And that's actually not exactly nice because there is no refresh button on top of all this. And there's also a bit of bugs actually in Progress Developer Studio. So you kind of lose some of your time doing that. But it's working. I mentioned before on the previous slide that it has a lot of artifacts being saved in order to hold this entire mapping between HTTP request and your procedure. And that's a lot of files. If you guys have used Roundtable before, this is not going to work into Roundtable at all because Roundtable is file-based. This is a project, and it has a specific structure. So you're forced to use Git or anything that accepts an entire Forge structure. This is just an example on if you're using a procedure, this is just a super easy example on how you could do that. My advice actually would be to, in case you have one procedure that already has some code in it, don't include that directly. You can do that, but it's not a good idea to have that one because it's not exactly future-proof. Instead, just create your dummy interface. It's super easy. You should have standard input and output parameters, and most important, it's actually the output parameter. I mentioned before that if you, for example, change one single field in your data set, it might be even the serialized name, it doesn't matter. You need to remap it again in order for OpenEdge actually to know the structure of your JSON. But it's a lot easier to expose a long char as output parameter, dump your data sets into a JSON and send it out, directly mapping the long char to the response body, not inside the body, but on the body. That makes a huge difference. Same goes as input data. In case you want to receive data, instead of reading directly from the request body and map it into your data sets, just take the entire request body and parse it yourself. It's super easy, and actually it will save you a lot of headaches. In case you're using request headers, it might be because you want to access the accept language. Everybody knows that. Nowadays, your application needs to be localized in different languages. So that's done via the accept language. Your browser fills it in automatically in case you don't use it internally in your application. So you can use that in order to translate your messages coming from the backend or something like that. Same idea. You have via drag and drop capability to read directly from the request header, but it's not a good idea. Better just take the entire request header and parse it internally. It's not super difficult to do that. It will save you some headaches. Handlers. What you see on the right, it's actually the only user interface that you will see that has to do with handlers. Handlers are new, and this is what Progress is actually pushing in order to speed up the modernization progress. And what's interesting about it is that it's a lot more flexible because you, instead of having access to some specific areas of your request, like only the header or only the query parameters, you have access to the entire request. And the same goes for your web response. What's a bit annoying with that is that on the right side, there's an example where I have a handler called media handler. And it's exposing only two URIs. That's super, super easy. But the order you add the URIs, it's actually super important. Because unlike the REST adapter, which does a full match against your URI, so order that it's not important. In this case, the specific application server, it's using a begins with clause. So the last one I have over there, it's media/files. If in my web request I write get me media/files do something, it will still work. And it will match the last one. I'm not exactly the fan of that. There's also another one which is actually interesting. How many of you actually has messed up with the Progress Application Server configuration? Yeah. So you do it inside the OpenEdge Management Console, or are you actually used to do it via TCMan or actually messing up directly OpenEdge properties? Yeah, okay. Well, that's not exactly for the saint of heart doing that, right? So imagine that we have a lot of backend developers. Most of them have no idea what a configuration file is, because that's more likely, let's say, DevOps or a tools engineer or someone that actually knows how to deal with that. That's his main job. The developer needs to code. Well, the bad side is that all your handler mapping goes inside the OpenEdge property files. And that's not exactly super good, but there are ways to get past it, and there are tools that help you do that, or you can write your very own tool, because what PDS does, there is some kind of configuration when you do that saved in a JSON, so you can parse that one and fill up your OpenEdge property files automatically. Advices: if you want to go with handlers, that's super nice. It's always a good idea to do that. Don't start by using handlers. Start by actually extending the web handler interface. This is OP. It has nothing to do with procedural programming. You can't use procedures. You are forced to use classes, and you are forced to implement an interface called iWebHandler, or just extend the webhandler class. It's here basically that you'll have access to everything that has to do with the request, but you'll have to code even the pre-flight in case you want to do that. Everything is codable. You don't receive anything out of box. My advice actually is to start by adding your session manager class. This is not a class that you will find out of the box in OpenEdge, but you can get some inspiration on how to deal with that from OE era project. What it does, in my case, is just establishing identity roles and set all kinds of restrictions. I'm pretty sure all your applications have that kind of issues. And also, I mentioned before all the headers, HTTP headers that you should deal with in case you want to deal with languages, date formats, basically localization or internationalization. Same thing. It's a good place to have something like that and store it inside so that you have access to it later on. There's also something called HTTP response error. Again, that you're not forced to do that. This is just an example. In my case, I like actually to intercept all kinds of runtime errors. It might be a runtime error because I'm doing something stupid in my application, or it might be an error that I'm raising from inside my application. So if I'm doing that, it doesn't matter the level I'm doing that. I want it back into the web response and in a nicely formatted JSON structure so that my colleague in the front end knows that's an error and I need to show it. Because if you play it with errors, especially runtime errors, you will notice that in OpenEdge, actually, they're hard-coded with something underscore error, and I want something differently. This might help you. Documentation. Well, everybody wants to have documentation on APIs, and there are a couple of tools out there that you can use, and one of them is Swagger, which is super cool and offers tons of possibilities. We don't use that, but instead we use something called API.js. And what I like about that is that it's based on annotations that actually go directly inside your comments of your classes or procedure. Why is that nice to me, at least? It's because I can keep all the documentation at the same time with all my coding. So whenever I need to revisit that and do some adjustments, I don't have to open another project, which is Swagger, in order to keep up with the documentation. I just update the annotation, and my API doc gets triggered automatically. It can be triggered automatically.
Yeah, that it's,
yes.
Since it's the same project, you can do code reviews also on the documentation.
This is something actually interesting, because if you care about documentation, you would also want to review the documentation portion whenever you want to check in some files. Also nice about it is that it can be triggered automatically. It's basically just an NPM project, and it has a command line to trigger that. And since you want to host it for your developers or for third-party software integrations, Well, you don't need a server to do that because you have Tomcat. The application server is built on Tomcat, so you can just host it directly on Tomcat.
Now, some words about consuming the REST APIs, because basically no matter the front-end technology you're using, you need to have a structured way of doing that. Otherwise, it will fall apart pretty quickly, and we kind of learned that the hard way. So first advice would be that all your services in the front end that consume the REST APIs should live in the same folder or package, if it's the case, or module, in case of Angular. What that does is keep the thing structured and also keep the unit tests for that in the same place. And also, in our case, what these services do is format the response according to the front-end needs. Also for URLs, I know some people are struggling with the domain, but what we do actually to maintain a really RESTful service is keep all the URLs in a hierarchical structure. And what we have is actually a huge JSON tree. And so what you do when you call this is build up a path with a dot separator, and we have a function that goes through the JSON tree and builds up the URL. So in that sense, you cannot really go wrong with the URL, and there's no typos. Also, if you want to consume REST APIs, best idea would be to have a HTTP interceptor in your front end. And again, no matter the technology, here I'm showing Angular 7, but it can be React, it can be Vue.js, whatever. The advantage of this thing is that, for example, for the authentication headers, you can set them automatically, set the token. For internationalization, you can do the same thing. Also, here I'm showing configuring the request to always include the credential, meaning cookies, in case of form authentication. And for the response, there's a couple of things that are really important, like catching 401 errors and redirecting to login page or the auth provider in case of OAuth. And also for other errors, like Mircea mentioned, since they're really good formatted from the backend, we need to have in the front end a function to deal with that. And we format the error proper to be viewed by the user in toaster messages and a lot of other places, like when you click a button and you get the error right beside it that you didn't complete the form correctly or something like that.
Okay, let's talk about reporting. Like many other customers, we did have a reporting solution, and that was based basically on Crystal reports. Did anybody use Crystal reports before? Yeah. Did you use it on the web? That's the reason we needed to change that. Because like any other companies, this is an application that was Windows-based, but we wanted to move all the shift of power actually into the cloud or into the portal or on the mobile. It doesn't matter, but it's not on Windows. So we had more than 40 reports. Most of them actually written years ago, and actually all the data was inside smart data objects. So it was pretty obvious that in this case, we can't actually design 40 reports from scratch. We did take Telerik report for a spin, and the fun part about that one is that it does offer a report viewer that is also suitable on the web, it's also suitable on the mobiles, and it's suitable also on Windows in case you want to do that. Our target was a HTML5 report, and what we did instead of defining one template for each report is that actually we have identified what's common to all the reports. And there is some visualization options that you can unify. In our case, there were a lot of reports that actually used grids actually to show numbers, data, accumulations, and so on and so on. So instead of doing that, we have defined only 4 reports that are actually not reports, but dummy templates that we could fill up later when running at runtime and actually show it. So how's that done? Basically, this is just a template. Is an example of a generic Telerik template. As you can see, it has no data, but it has a lot of placeholders. I know that I want to support, let's say, 20 columns top. I know that I want to have grouping and sorting, so I can add some expressions. In doing that, I know that I want my customer's logo. By the way, we are ISVs, so each customer actually has the option to change that into his own logo. But it's just a template, that's all. So how do we actually fill it up? Well, at runtime, whenever you actually run the report, it's going through our REST API pipeline, and it's going to that famous smart data objects that I was mentioning, which is old code. But it also the fact that we have the Telerik template. So I'm having just a dummy template. I have the data. Now it's time to put it together. So there's no one actually stopping you to accessing via ABL your Telerik reporting classes. And that's pretty powerful, actually, because you can manipulate the template. You can even create a report from scratch using ABL. There's no one stopping you to do that. So what we advise is actually starting with some base formatters. That's your base class, let's say. Try to extend that for each of your template in case you have custom logic, but you still be able to reuse some of the core stuff, and then save it into the final report. And in order to show that one, actually, you will need something called Telerik Reporting Web API. And that is an API designed by Telerik in order to just show reports. It doesn't run reports. You don't have access to any kind of data. The sole purpose of that one is to create instances, cache reports, and send out HTML for each page, and a lot of parameters back to the client application in order to control what's searching, what's the format being displayed, if it's on the mobile or not, or on which page am I, and so on and so on. And for doing that, you actually need to create or implement this Telerik Reporting API. You can do that on IIS. In case you have a web application that is ASP.NET based, you can do that easily. In our case, we don't have a web API application. So what you can do instead is do a self-hosted application. There's already some tutorials on Telerik platform in order to do that. And you can also even incorporate it in a Windows service so that you have full control over the service, authentication, logging, deployment, and so on and so on.
So now that we have a really cool REST API for viewing reports, we employed the Telerik Report Viewer to actually show them in the front ends. And what's nice about the fact that it's web component and we have some wrappers over it in order to make it Angular-like because it's not exactly Angular-based. What we can do is actually run it from multiple viewports and parts of our application. On the right-hand side to the top, we have our reporting solution, which was the first thing we implemented using all our 40 reports. But on the lower portion, we have the same report viewed from a whole different part of our application where an employee sees his own data. Also, in case of mobile, we're not using Telerik Report Viewer because, well, form factor, basically. But what we can do is have a button, I'm not sure if it's visible, it's called List Transactions, which actually also runs the report, but it exports a PDF version of it, so we can download it to the device.
Yep. Alrighty.
Last topic.
Last topic, yeah. Security and authentications. Does anybody use the Progress application servers up until 11.7 or something like that? Or are you stuck on the classic app server? Yeah, okay. You need to move. Yeah, excellent. That's a wise choice. It's super critical that you have security in your application, right? So in case you're not familiar, if you're using the new Progress application server, you can define basically something called web ABL applications. And inside that one, you can define what is actually the security model that you want to go with. And under the hood, it's actually, most of them are using Spring Security, which is a pretty robust framework. And there are plenty of configuration files which allow you to actually define what is it actually that you want it to do. If you have, for example, in your application, a custom users table, and probably most of you do that, then you will need to implement something called OI Realm. That's OpenEdge's approach when it comes to custom tables. User tables, and inside of Spring Security, there's something called an interface called Hybrid Realm, but fortunately that's a Progress ABL class, which you can implement and define your custom logic. What custom logic might that be? This is all based on the client principal object. So in case you're not familiar to that, read up a bit, just a bit. The client principal object is just a way to enforce security upon a database. So you have the option upon creation of this client principal object, but before it's sealed, to add some custom information into custom attributes, or imagine that you have roles in your application to set identity and restrictions. That's also the place that you add all those custom roles inside your client principal object, because this is added only once whenever you do the login, but all subsequent requests just use that client principal object, and you want to have access to that so that you can enforce your security on the backend portion. Also, nowadays everybody's crazy and mad about LDAP. Imagine corporate consumers applications. They want to do authentication using Active Directory. That's also something that you can do directly with Spring. Of course, you will need to know what is your Active Directory configuration and architecture. There are tools that actually help you drill down into that one and see what is actually the organization unit that I need to use, what is the filter that I need to use to set up my account and so on. But most likely, you will need a special lookup account in order to do that, because not everybody's account is allowed to actually impersonate everybody and get information about everybody. So that's a special lookup account. Also, if you're up to a challenge and install OpenEdge 11.7.4, then you'll also get something called OpenEdge Authentication Gateway. That was, I think, presented also last year or something like that. That's a nice central place to actually secure your application. And it's like your request comes in case you want to do that. Your request does come into the application server, but it gets delegated to a different server, which is the OpenEdge Authentication Gateway. It might be on the same server, it's just a different Pacific application server. What does that is that it can, at its own point, use under the hood OE realm or LDAP, but it's delegated. And there's one advantage that I see when doing that. Imagine that, like I said previously, you have a huge corporation and everybody's mad about logging with let's say, John Doe at Microsoft.com. That, because I'm writing at Microsoft.com, you have an option to configure OEAG to go to LDAP. And it's one single instance, the same application server, the same ABL web application. But if I'm just writing John Doe, that I want it to go to my internal application and I need to enter a password or something like that, has nothing to do with the Active Directory. And that's something OEAG can help with. But it's important to notice that OEAG actually is not a middleware. You can't do any kind of crazy combinations like that. So if you want to do OAuth, SAML, single sign-on in general, you can't do that with OEAG because it will always expect a username and a password. So it's only form. So if you want to combine all that, you will need to basically copy or duplicate your ABL web application. Since I mentioned single sign-on, want to go through OAuth. How many of you have used OAuth before or actually know what OAuth is? No? Okay. Imagine that you want to have single sign-on capabilities in case you're using, let's say, Azure, Office 365, SharePoint, stuff like that that has to do with Microsoft technology, CRM, Dynamics, and so on. Most of them are actually based on OAuth too, because you might have multiple applications, but you want to log in only once. So I want to do that, but whenever I get back into my application, because it's still my corporate environment, I don't want it to be to ask me for a username and password. Hey, I'm already logged in into my organization, just use that. That's what it's one of the reasons OAuth is used. There are 4 access flows in order to do that, but most used are actually implicit grant and code grant. What that is basically the application will make a request to the authentication authority, which let's say it's Azure, and Azure will return back some tokens. It might be an ID token or an access token. Depending on the flow, it might be also that you do another request to get the token. So it's 2 requests instead of 1. But what's important is that it's not your application that does the authentication. It's not your Spring Security that does that. It's an external provider. That's why you'll probably get a pop-up to write that. Also, whenever the request gets back, actually you have a token that you will use forwards. But let's talk settings. Let's say I do want to do that, and I have my ABL web application. What you will need to do is change the client login model. This is just an example on how your security could use in case you're using Azure. And there's something that needs to be mentioned. I talked before that you will have a domain, basically. Let's say it's johndoe@microsoft.com. That Microsoft.com, in case you want to use that authentication domain, it needs to be defined into your database. In case you were not aware, if you're doing domain configurations, you'll see that there are a couple of domains that you can add. That's one of them. So if you want to, in case that you are forced actually to define your domain. And that's because the domain use on the client principal gets pushed inside the database. If there is no domain, it will simply not work.
Yeah.
No, sure.
On the client side, there are multiple flows that you can adopt to make the authentication against the auth provider. But what we decided to go with is login with pop-up, which basically means that if you're not logged into your organization, on first load of the application, by the way, I need to mention that we have a single-page application. It's not like ASP.NET or something like that, or PHP. So it's an Angular application. What it does is actually pops up the Microsoft login page. You log in, and then control is returned back to our application so we can present you your dashboard. The thing worth mentioning is that Microsoft has a weird way of doing things, unlike Google and Facebook and GitHub and whoever else is doing OAuth. What they do is that you give it a callback URL within your app, and it redirects within the pop-up to that URL. And what you have to do is instantiate a new instance of their library in order to close the pop-up and return control to the app. However, this is not hard because they provide a library called mstyle.js for that, which is in beta stage or something, preview stage. But we found that it works pretty good. And we're rolling out the OAuth like this release, hopefully.
Just a couple of keynotes, as it say, conclusions. Yeah. If it comes to REST APIs, if you do want to expose really fast and you don't want to mess up on leveraging your OOP skills or something like that, you can just use the REST adapter. It's super fast to expose data as JSON, period. If you want to go with rich media, for example, then you should use definitely the web handler. If it comes to performance, we did a few performance tests, and actually the difference is not that big. Actually, to be frank, the REST adapter came in faster than the web handler, which was weird. But anyway,
it's Java.
Yeah, it's Java, and it was faster. I don't know why. Testing, that's super critical for your data. If you do have Postman, how many of you are familiar with Postman? You should. Just Google Postman. That's a cool tool to actually define a lot of API collections. You can define the authorization. You can define, even write tests to test your API against, let's say, timing. I want my API to be fast. If it's my GET request goes beyond 300 milliseconds, then I want a red flag. Something like that can be defined using Postman, and it's also something that you can share. Also, there are a lot of other tools that do stress testing on APIs like Test Studio, or even just if you're familiar to Java, just open your Eclipse and write your own tests. That's not super critical. Reporting, the Telerik Report Viewer does offer views for both HTML5 and WinForms. And there's also a second tool, which actually it's part of a different license, which is called Telerik Report Server. That's another application, but you could use that actually to store all your reports, all those reports that you have run, to define security permissions or share the reports, and even better actually to schedule reports. And that's super cool, actually. If it comes to security, well, the nice thing about OAG and OE Realm is that you do have access to the client principal object before it's sealing. Otherwise, if you're using OAuth SAML, it's already sealed when you have access to a client principal object. You can't add anything, you can't change anything, you can just use it. That's because everything happens actually in the cloud. You just receive a token. And most important, that's something to notice, OAG can include OERM and LDAP per domain, so it's still one single domain, one single application server, one single ABL web application, but it can't be combined with OAuth. That's actually for me a bit of a disappointment. Last but not least, if you're not in the cloud or you're not supporting single sign-on, well, that's a requirement that most modern applications already have, and users are, well, picky. You'll go to sunset mode in case you're not doing that.
Okay, so we have about 4 minutes of questions.
A bit of time.
If anybody has one. Great. We've been, yeah.
Yes.
Should.
So for the API docs.js,
yep.
Are you reading annotations directly in your OpenEdge code?
Yes, basically, it's not the annotation that generates, for example, the ABL doc, because that's something differently. It's basically annotation that you add inside your comments, because there needs to be a comment tag. So it has nothing to do with that.
I think I can scroll back.
Yes, you can scroll back, but there's also something.
It's reading your source code generated.
Yes, it is your source code. That's
Is
the
it
fact.
visible?
You can zoom, I think.
How?
Work your PowerPoint magic.
PowerPoint magic.
Yes.
Is that all?
No, press again. Click. Okay.
Yes.
So it's just a comment header, and it's still in the comment. That's the only thing that you need. Pipe, stars, 2 stars. That's the only thing. It has a pretty good documentation actually, and it's also able to provide an example of your data. And if your video scrolls down just a bit, this is an example actually how it's looking. And it also includes your test my API thingy. So you can write a request and it will go through directly and do all the magic.
However, we don't recommend doing that for put and posts.
Well, if they want to do that, so be it.
Yeah. But the gets are really awesome.
Yeah. There's also one thing that I do like. If you scroll back up, there's also something called API use. If you're familiar to, well, it's like a variable or a template or a macro, actually. You can define something called success standard. In my case, I know that all my data, I want it to be packaged like a response.data and then everything that has to do with my JSON data. But I'm sick and tired of writing this all the time. So I'm just defining it once, I give it a name, and then I just use API use. That's something super useful when doing that. And also it has the power to say, yeah, but this is the structure, and it needs to be hierarchical structure, but this is a JSON object, so it's an array of JSON objects. And you can also say, this is an optional parameter. It might be that you don't send it, or the value of this parameter needs to be 1, 2, or 3, something like that. Or strings, or dates, or numbers. It doesn't matter, but it's possible.
What it translates to is actually like also a tree structure, if you might, because there's like indentation.
Yep. And
it says the type and description, so it's really nice. And it's still an Angular app, which we're familiar with, and we had a bit of trouble with this one, and because we're Angular developers, we hacked it. So.
Yeah, that's because we wanted to have the ProMark logo, company logo, and stuff like that, which was nice always.
Okay. Any other questions?
Then thank you all for coming. If you do have anything else, just stop us by and let us know.
We're still here tomorrow.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.